Production database accumulated $0 transactions for ineligible users. The root cause: Pydantic silently coerces empty strings to 0 for float fields. Let's break down FastAPI request body and Pydantic models, how it works, and the exact mistake behind that failure. FastAPI uses Pydantic models to define the structure of request bodies. When a client sends JSON, FastAPI automatically parses it into a Pydantic model instance, validating every field. If validation fails, a 422 error is returned with detailed messages. Define a model by subclassing base model and adding fields with type hints. Use field to add constraints like GT=0. Pydantic automatically coerces compatible types, e.g., string 9999, to float. Here's a basic Pydantic model forge item with fields name, price, isActive, and description. The endpoint accepts a JSON body matching this model. Pydantic handles nested models and lists automatically. Each nested field is validated recursively. If any field fails, the entire request is rejected with a 422 error. Here, Forge user contains an address model and a list of tags. FastAPI validates the entire nested structure. For complex validation, use @field validator. It runs after coercion and can transform the value or raise a value error with a custom message. This validator ensures the SKU field is uppercase. If not, it raises a value error which FastAPI returns as a 422 error. FastAPI allows mixing path parameters, query parameters, and a Pydantic body in one endpoint. Use path and query to avoid ambiguity. Here, orderIt is a path parameter, update is the body, and dryrun is a query parameter. FastAPI routes them correctly. Always define a separate response model to avoid leaking sensitive data like passwords. FastAPI filters the output to match the response model. The endpoint returns a userout model, which excludes the password field. This prevents accidental data leaks. Default validation errors are unambiguous but ugly. A custom exception handler can return a cleaner format that front-end teams can parse easily. This handler transforms the error list into a clean field, message, code format. Add this globally in your app factory. Pydantic models give your editor a contract it can read. Autocomplete, type checking, and typo detection happen before you run the server. With a model, your IDE knows the fields. Typing user shows autocomplete. Misspelling a field is caught immediately. Response models turn your API into a contract. FastAPI ensures every response matches the declared shape, catching errors at startup. If you return a dict missing a field, FastAPI raises a validation error. This ensures your API is predictable. Pydantic validators are synchronous. For async checks like database lookups, do them in the endpoint or via depends. The async validation happens after the body is parsed. This keeps the event loop responsive. CORS prevents browsers from sharing responses across origins, but it's not a security feature. Always whitelist specific origins in production. Lock CORS origins to explicit domains. Wildcard origins are only safe for public read-only endpoints. This is the same issue we highlighted at the start. Here's exactly why that happened. The client sent an empty string for the price field. Pydantic coerced it to 0 because float returned 0. There was no GT=0 constraint, so the invalid value was accepted and stored. Pydantic coerces empty string to 0 for float fields without raising an error, silently corrupting financial data. Adding GT=0 constraint and a validator to reject empty strings forces validation to fail on invalid input. The fix was to add field GT=0 and a validator that explicitly checks for empty string. Now, if the client sends an empty string, a 422 error is returned instead of silently recording $0. If you don't add constraints like GT=0, an empty string coerces to 0 for float fields. This caused a fintech to record $0 transactions for months. Pydantic validators cannot be async. If you mark one as async, it still runs synchronously and blocks the event loop. This is the exact line that caused the incident. Without GT equals 0, an empty string becomes 0. Always add numeric constraints on monetary fields. Avoid I/O in validators. Move database lookups to the endpoint handler. Validators should be pure and fast. Never return the input model as the response model. Always define a separate output schema to avoid exposing internal fields. If you set allow origins equals asterisk with allow credentials equals true, FastAPI silently drops credentials. Your cookies won't be sent. The article uses at field validator, Pydantic v2, but also references at validator v1. If you're on Pydantic v1, replace at field validator with at validator and model validate with validate. The model dump method is v2, in v1 use dict. Always check your Pydantic version to avoid runtime errors. The article mentions cross-field validation, but only shows field-level validators. Use at model validator, v2, to validate interdependent fields, e.g., ensuring end date is after start date. This runs after all field validators. The article warns against leaking fields, but doesn't emphasize that using the same model for input and output couples your internal schema to the API contract. Even if fields match today, future changes, e.g., adding an internalid, will leak. Always define a dedicated output model, even if it's a copy. When you get a 422 error, check the detail field. Use Swagger to generate valid examples. Validate nested models in isolation to find the issue. Let's run through some common interview questions. How does FastAPI distinguish body versus query? Uses type hint location. Model without query is body. Explain data coercion lifecycle. Pydantic parses JSON, checks type, coerces if compatible, runs validators. How to optimize validation for large payloads. Use Pydantic v2, avoid heavy validators, split payloads. And a few frequently asked questions. What's the difference between optional SDR and optional SDR equals none? The latter makes the key optional, the former still requires the key. Can I use different models for request and response? Yes, use response model in the decorator. How to handle partial updates. Make all fields optional and use exclude unset equals true. To recap, Pydantic models define the contract for your API. Always add constraints, separate input-output models, and test edge cases. This prevents silent data corruption and keeps your API robust. Ready to go deeper? Up next, FastAPI response models and status codes, then FastAPI dependency injection, then FastAPI authentication. Find them all at TheCodeForge.io. Thanks for watching. The full article and code examples are covered in detail at TheCodeForge.io.